right, boys and girls, it's time to review a little bit for this third 9 weeks test. What you see in front of you are some pages that have different slides. You're not going to be required to know every single thing on these slides, but I want to highlight and point out to you some important topics when it comes to these certain subjects. So we're going to start by talking weather versus climate. We know that weather is what's happening outside of our window at a very specific time over a short period of time. So that's usually days, weeks, could be months, but usually when you start to get into the months, that's a little bit longer time period. We know weather is going to look at temperature, could be air pressure, measuring with a barometer, wind speed and direction, humidity, and precipitation. If you're talking over a long period of time, especially this word average, okay? And when we have that long period, now we're talking seasons, we're talking decades or centuries. That's when we're going to have to call it climate, okay? So you need to distinguish between those two. So climates, we know, are influenced based on where they are on the earth, their latitude, how far are they from the equator, maybe how close are they to the poles. Other things that could influence the climate in a region could be how close they are to large bodies of water, maybe ocean currents in the area, or their elevation. So do you live up in the mountains or do you live close to sea level? We see here the example they give us Houston's climate. So their usual, typical patterns that they see are warm and wet in the summer with tropical storms, and they don't get too cold in the winter. Okay, so that would be their climate information. We see here these climate zones. We know the closest to the equator is going to experience these tropical, warm, wet type climates. Can also be dry. If you move up towards where the United States is, here at our line of latitude, we're considered to be in the temperate zone, which means we have seasons. You're going to find the same thing as you go south of the equator along South America and parts of Africa, Australia, Madagascar, areas like that. And then if you go to the extremes, to the polars, this is going to be extremely dry and cold. Remember, you can have deserts. We've seen the largest desert in Antarctica, and that's because it gets such little precipitation. So just because something is cold doesn't mean that it's not a desert. It actually can be, because that is all due to the amount of precipitation. Weather conditions. So these are different things that we've looked at related to weather. So you need to just kind of look over these, understand what these are, and maybe what's used to measure them. We know that air pressure is where we're talking about high and low air pressure. And depending on what we see, that's going to help determine the weather patterns that we have. If you start talking about the average precipitation, the average temperature in an area, this is when you start talking about climate data. So we call these weather conditions, but if you start looking at these over a long period of time, that's when we're going to call it climate. Okay? Types of clouds, this is just some fun information. In 5th grade, we're not required to learn the different types of clouds, but for those of you that are interested, feel free to take a look at this slide. We know precipitation comes in the form of rain, sleet, hail, or snow. We know that we measure liquid precipitation with a rain gauge. Okay, typically snow, we would just measure with a ruler and we would see how many inches we get. Depending on the moisture in the snow, roughly it takes about 8 inches of snow to equal an inch of rain. The snow that we recently had, the initial snow was pretty dry, so they were saying about 12 inches to make an inch of rain. But then the second snow that we got was a little bit more moist. Okay, air pressure. This is when we start looking at that barometer. It kind of looks like a clock face. We see we have high pressures on the right side, low pressures on the left. And so typically we're going to see high pressures associated with warmer temperatures. The weather is going to be sunny. It's going to be warmer. And so what I use to help us remember this with the high pressure is Happy Uncle Harry. So the H for Harry reminds us that Happy Uncle Harry brings sunny skies and warm temperatures. However, Lousy Aunt Lucy has been in town here recently. We've had cooler temperatures and we've had rain. So barometer is going to be the tool used to measure that. These are just some symbols that you may see when you're looking at a weather forecast. You could also use these if you're looking at climate information. So if a region of the area has a lot of rain, that's their typical weather pattern, then you could also see those there. We did talk a little bit about fronts when we studied weather and climate, cold front versus warm front. However, it's not necessary that you know exactly what these are. But what you do have to know is the vocabulary for water cycle. We know that the water cycle is also helping to drive our weather patterns. So that's why we talk about these all during the same unit. So I want you to make sure that you read over each one of these terms and that you understand the definition, okay? So taking what we know here and applying it to our diagram, it's critical that you could cover up the words on this diagram and be able to label it and to be able to understand what that process is, okay? We talked about what's the first step in the water cycle. There's really not. It's a cycle. It continues on and on. We usually jump in at the process of evaporation. We know this is where we have liquid water that is being heated by the sun's energy. It is changing from a liquid into a gas, okay? So evaporation is liquid to a gas. Notice that part of the word vapor in evaporation. So we are going from liquid water to vapor water or gaseous water, okay? As that starts to rise in the atmosphere, it starts to cool down. And when it does, that's when we have condensation, or it condenses, which is the opposite of evaporation. This is where we have that the gaseous water turning back into a liquid, and this is when it starts to form clouds. As we start to accumulate more moisture in the clouds, this eventually will lead to precipitation. We mentioned that earlier, rain, sleet, hail, or snow falling back to the earth. And when you have excess water, like we've seen here recently, that's when we get this runoff. It's going to be running off higher areas of higher elevation to areas of lower elevation. And then we see that it accumulates in puddles, lakes, streams, rivers, and ultimately the ocean. We cannot forget about a very important process here known as transpiration. This is a special form of evaporation where trees, any plant, is losing water into the atmosphere. This happens a great deal during the hot summer months, and especially if the humidity is low, plants are going to lose a lot of water into the atmosphere. Okay, so transpiration. Another one we talked briefly about during the water cycle was percolation. So I mentioned how water percolates through my coffee grounds to make my coffee in the morning. So water also percolates through the ground, and it can actually collect in underground collection areas or accumulation areas known as aquifers. And then we can tap into those and actually use that water for drinking, cooking, bathing, things like that. Ultimately, we know that the water cycle is driven by the sun's energy. That heat is causing the water to evaporate. So you see that here. And we know the majority of evaporation is happening from our oceans because the earth is covered 70 to 75% covered in water, and the majority of that water is ocean water. Okay, so if you have any questions about weather or climate or water cycle, please make sure that you talk to your teacher and seek out clarification, and make sure that you review over these slides.